I will tell you about the 70 hours, because that is what the Coalition Council asked me to explain, and because I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. My name is Tael Veska. I held the rank of Watch Commander aboard the INV Tesserath, a joint species patrol cruiser assigned to the Deep Space Transit Corridor known as the Helith Reach. The Tesserath carried a complement of 182 crew drawn from 4 coalition species: Oseni, Dale, Verothi, and human. The Oseni contingent, my people, made up the command staff and the majority of the crew. The Dale ran navigation and signals. The Verothi handled environmental systems and atmospheric regulation. The humans numbered 4 out of 182. They were technical specialists assigned to us under the terms of the 7th Coalition Accord, which required the inclusion of human personnel in all deep space patrol rotations regardless of fleet composition. At the time of the Tesserath's commissioning, the Accord was 9 months old. We had not yet learned to take it seriously. The human contingent consisted of a signals analyst, a structural integrity technician, a field medic, and a maintenance systems engineer. Their quarters were on Deck 7, near the secondary galley. They kept to themselves. They did not eat with us, not out of hostility, but because their food smelled like something burning, and they seemed to prefer it that way. They were professional, competent, and entirely unremarkable, which was the general consensus among my officers, and which I endorsed in my first 3 monthly reports to Coalition, Fleet Command. The maintenance systems engineer was named Colm Brannick. I want you to understand what Colm Brannick looked like, because it matters. He was not tall. He was not imposing. He was not the kind of human you see in the combat footage, the lean, fast ones with the Predator's stillness. Brannick was mid-40s by Earth reckoning, broad across the shoulders but soft in the middle, with thinning hair, the color of wet sand and hands that looked like they had been built for a slightly larger person, and then attached to him by mistake. His face defaulted to a mild, tolerant expression. The face of a man who has been asked to fix something slightly beneath his skill level and is too polite to say so. He drank coffee, constantly. I did not know what coffee was before the Tesserath, I learned. Coffee is a liquid stimulant derived from a roasted plant seed native to the African subcontinent of Earth. Humans consume it in enormous quantities, often multiple times per waking cycle, frequently beginning consumption within minutes of waking. Brannick carried a personal thermal vessel, a battered steel cylinder with a dented lid, from which he poured this substance at intervals. Throughout his shift, the smell was not unpleasant, bitter, dark, slightly acrid. The Verothi atmospheric technicians complained that it interfered with their olfactory calibration, but Brannick ignored this with the serene confidence of a man who has been told his habits are annoying many times before and has decided he does not care. He reported to his station at the start of each cycle. He performed his duties. He left. That was the sum of Colm Brannick, maintenance systems engineer for the first 11 days of the Tesserath's transit. I should note one detail from those first 11 days that I dismissed at the time and that I have thought about constantly since. On the 6th day, the atmospheric recycling system on Deck 4 threw an intermittent fault, minor, non-critical, the kind of glitch that presents during transit due to vibration harmonics in the ductwork. It required monitoring and periodic adjustment. Reth Sohal assigned the task to Brannick and Koresh in rotation. Brannick for the first 12 hours, Koresh for the next 12, then Brannick again until the fault resolved. Brannick took the first shift. At the end of his 12 hours, Koresh arrived to relieve him. I know this because I reviewed the lattice logs afterward. Go sleep, Koresh said. I'm good for a bit. Let me finish this calibration sequence and I'll hand it over clean. A bit turned out to be 4 hours. Brannick stayed 16 hours on a 12-hour task, not because the task demanded it, but because he wanted to deliver it in a state he considered complete. He then slept 5 hours, not 7, not 8, 5, and returned to his normal duties the next morning without apparent impairment. The lattice flagged the 5-hour sleep as below recommended minimum. Brannick did not respond to the flag. No one followed up. A 5-hour rest after a 16-hour day was, I learned later, common enough among human technical workers that they had a phrase for it. Short night. It did not warrant attention. It did not warrant concern. It was unremarkable. I saw this in the lattice logs a week later, after the drive failure, and I remember the cold feeling in my chest when I realized what it meant. A 16-hour shift followed by 5 hours of sleep was not a crisis behavior for Brannick. It was a Tuesday. The other humans operated similarly. The signals analyst, a woman named Priya Fen, routinely logged 14-hour wakefulness periods despite being scheduled for 12. The field medic, Dal Oscar, once stayed awake for 22 hours during a routine drill because as he explained to the duty officer who queried the lattice flag. I wanted to see how the Varothi decompression protocol compared to ours, and the demonstration was scheduled during my sleep cycle, so I skipped it. He meant he skipped sleep, not the demonstration. These were the small signs, the unremarkable data points, the evidence that was always there in the lattice's logs, available to anyone who bothered to look. None of us looked. We had no reason to. The species database said humans slept 7 to 8 hours per cycle. The humans aboard the Tesseract slept, on average, 6.3. The discrepancy was within the tolerance range of what we would expect from any crew on deployment. Slightly compressed schedules, minor deviations, nothing alarming. We did not understand that the discrepancy was not a deviation, it was a feature. But I am getting ahead of myself. On the 12th day, the transit drive failed. I should explain the Helath Reach to anyone reading this who has not served on a deep space patrol. The Reach is a corridor, 140 light-years of navigable transit space connecting the inner coalition systems to the outer periphery. Stations. It is empty. There are no waypoints, no stations, no habitable systems, no emergency anchorages. The transit takes 14 standard days at cruise velocity. If you lose your drive in the Reach, you do not coast to the nearest port. You sit in deep vacuum, in a region of space so thoroughly surveyed and so thoroughly empty that no one is coming for you unless your distress beacon reaches a relay, and the nearest relay is 7 days away at signal speed. We were on day 12. 2 days from the periphery stations. The transit drive began throwing fault codes at 0340 hours, ship time. I was asleep. The Ossini sleep cycle is 10 standard hours, and it is not negotiable. I do not mean this idiomatically. I mean that the Ossini central nervous system requires 10 hours of uninterrupted sleep per cycle in order to maintain cognitive function, emotional regulation, endocrine stability, and basic motor coordination. At 12 hours without sleep, an Ossini begins to experience perceptual distortion. At 16 hours, fine motor control degrades. At 20 hours, we hallucinate. At 24 hours, neural pathway degradation begins, the kind that does not reverse cleanly. At 30 hours, the organ cascade starts. This is not weakness, this is baseline biology for every spacefaring species we have encountered. The Dale sleep cycle is 8 standard hours, with similar degradation thresholds. The Varothi require 12. The Keseth, who were not aboard the Tesseract, but whom I have served alongside in other postings, require 14. In every case, the pattern is the same. A rigid biological clock governs cognitive function, and exceeding its limits produces rapid, predictable, and in many cases, irreversible damage. The Tesseract's medical systems were designed around this reality. The ship's AI, a Dale-built system we called the Lattice, monitored every crew, members' sleep compliance in real time via subcutaneous biosensor implants. If any individual approached their species-specific fatigue threshold, the Lattice flagged it. If they exceeded it, the Lattice could lock them out of their station and route their duties to a rested replacement. It had done this 11 times in the first 12 days, all for Varothi atmospheric technicians who kept insisting they could finish one more calibration before their cycle ended. The Lattice disagreed. The Lattice was always right. The humans had biosensors too. Standard coalition issue, implanted before deployment. Their sleep thresholds were listed in the species database as follows. Recommended cycle, 7 to 8 standard hours. Performance degradation onset, 16 to 18 hours. Critical threshold, 24 hours. Mandatory stand down, 28 hours. Those numbers had been provided by the human delegation to the Coalition Medical Standards Board during the Accord negotiations. I believed them at the time. I no longer do. The transit drive fault codes at ZO340 were the beginning. By ZO400, the drive was in partial shutdown, shedding velocity and threatening a full cascade failure that would have dropped us out of transit and into hard vacuum with no way to restart. My senior engineer, an Osseni named Reth Sohal, pulled the emergency assessment and gave me the timeline. 70 hours, minimum. The transit drive's harmonic stabilizers had developed a resonance fracture across 3 of the 7 primary coil assemblies. The coils could be repaired, but the repair was sequential. Each coil had to be isolated, recalibrated, and tested before the next could be addressed. And the isolation process required continuous manual monitoring of the drive's magnetic containment envelope. If the envelope fluctuated during a repair window, the work had to be restarted from scratch. Automated monitoring was insufficient. The Lattice could track the envelope's gross parameters, but the fine fluctuations that would ruin a repair were below its detection threshold. Someone had to sit at the containment console and watch the readings, continuously, for the entire duration of each coil repair. Each coil repair took 8 to 12 hours. 3 coils meant 24 to 36 hours of continuous monitoring, plus setup, diagnostics, testing, contingency. Reth Sohal's estimate of 70 hours was, if anything, conservative. I looked at the duty roster. The Tesseract had 14 qualified engineers, 8 Oseni, 3 Dale, 1 Varothi, and 2 humans, Brannick and the structural integrity technician, a woman named Yana Koresh. The monitoring task did not require exceptional skill. Any qualified engineer could do it, but it required someone to be awake, alert, and attentive for the full duration of each coil repair, and the longest any Oseni could safely remain on duty was 16 hours. We would need to rotate. Reth Sohal drew up the schedule within the hour. The Oseni engineers would work in pairs, 12 hours on, 10 hours sleep, 12 hours on. The Dale would do the same on a tighter cycle. The Varothi engineer would take the shortest shifts. The humans were slotted in like everyone else. Brannick on 12-hour rotations, Koresh backing him up. The plan was clean, efficient, and completely adequate. It accounted for every biological constraint in the species database. It assumed that every crew member aboard the Tesseract was subject to the same fundamental limitation. They needed to sleep, and the need was non-negotiable. I remember Reth Sohal presenting the rotation schedule to the engineering team in the briefing room adjacent to the main engineering bay. 14 engineers seated around the display table, their shift assignments projected in colored blocks on the overhead screen. Oseni shifts in blue, Dale in green, Varothi in amber, human in white. The white blocks were the same size as everyone else's. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Neat, equitable. Based on the numbers in the database. Kellis Vor asked the question that, in retrospect, should have changed everything. What if we fall behind schedule? The repair window is tight. If we lose a shift to a spike miss or a recalibration error, the entire timeline pushes right. Reth Sohal nodded. Then we extend shifts by up to 4 hours from the reserve pool, but no one goes beyond 16. The lattice will enforce it. What about the humans? What about them? Their stand-down threshold is 28 hours. That's 12 hours more than ours. If we fall behind, do we push them harder? Reth Sohal looked at me. I looked at Brannick, who was seated at the far end of the table, his thermal vessel in front of him, his expression, one of mild attention. He did not volunteer an answer. He did not indicate that the question was relevant to him. He looked like a man waiting for the meeting to end, so he could get back to work. We'll treat all species equally, I said. Standard rotation, standard limits, no one gets pushed harder than anyone else. Brannick's mouth twitched, that same compression of the lips. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. He knew. He knew that equal treatment, applied to unequal biology, would make the crisis about his species' ceiling while everyone else hit theirs first. He knew he would be the last one standing, and he did not say a word because it was not his place, and because telling us would have meant explaining something we were not ready to hear. The plan lasted about 30 hours before I realized it was based on a false premise. I should tell you what happened in those first 30 hours, because they were normal, or what I thought was normal, and the normalcy is part of the story. At Zo 500 on the first day, Reth Sohal's team began isolating the first coil. Brannick was assigned to the containment monitoring console for the first 12-hour rotation. He arrived at his station, carrying his thermal vessel, a folded jacket he placed on the back of his chair, and a small rectangular device he called a tablet, which he set on the console beside his readouts. I later learned it contained something called a podcast, which is an audio recording of humans talking to each other about subjects of interest. Brannick listened to these through a single earpiece while monitoring the containment envelope with the other ear free. This struck me as dangerous inattention. I said so. Commander, Brannick said, not looking up from his console, I've been doing containment monitoring since I was 22. The ear knows what the readings sound like before the eye does. If the envelope shifts, I'll hear it in the harmonics before I see it on the screen. I did not find this reassuring, but his first 3 hours were flawless. No fluctuations, no misses, no drift, and I had other problems to attend to, so I left him to it. At hour 6, I checked in. Brannick was in the same position. His coffee was half empty. His readings were clean. At hour 10, I checked again. He had refilled his coffee. His readings were still clean. He was listening to a different podcast, something about the history of bridge, construction on Earth. At hour 12, the shift change came. Brannick stood up, stretched, a full-body extension that produced a startling sequence of popping sounds from his joints, and handed the console to Reth Sohal's deputy, an Oseni named Kellis Vor. Brannick went to the secondary galley, ate something, and returned to his quarters. The lattice logged him as sleeping within 20 minutes. His biosensor showed a heart rate of 58 beats per minute at rest, a figure Lattice had flagged 6 times in the first week of the transit as anomalously low before a human medical addendum was uploaded explaining that this was normal for a healthy human of his age and fitness level. 12 hours later, Brannick was back at the console. The first coil repair was nearing completion. His readings were clean. The coil was isolated, recalibrated, and tested successfully at hour 26 of the overall repair timeline. 1 down, 2 to go. The second coil repair began at hour 28. Kellis Vor took the first monitoring shift. Brannick was scheduled to relieve her at hour 40. At hour 32, the complication arrived. The second coil's resonance fracture was worse than Reth Sohal's initial assessment. The harmonic instability was bleeding into the containment envelope at irregular intervals. Not the slow, predictable drift of the first repair, but sharp, random spikes that required immediate manual correction. Each spike lasted 1 to 3 seconds. Missing one would destabilize the coil and restart the repair from scratch. Kellis Vor caught the first 6 spikes. She caught the 7th. The 8th came while she was correcting the 7th, and she missed it. The repair restarted. I was on the bridge when Reth Sohal reported the miss. Her voice was controlled. Many officers do not display frustration in open channels, but I could hear the tightness beneath it. 8 hours of work erased in a fraction of a second. 8 hours we did not have. How did it happen? I asked. The spikes are clustering. 2 arrived within 0.6 seconds of each other. Kellis corrected the first and the second hit during her correction input. The containment envelope destabilized for 1.2 seconds. It was enough. Can we widen the detection window? Filter the spikes through the lattice? Negative. The spikes are below the lattice's fine detection threshold. They're audible in the harmonic register before they appear on screen, but the lattice's acoustic filters are calibrated for alarm tones, not harmonic shifts. Manual monitoring is the only reliable method. And Kellis? She's rattled. She knows she missed it. She's asking to go back on. But Commander, she was fully rested, 10 hours of sleep before her shift. She was operating at peak cognitive function. The problem isn't fatigue. The problem is neurological. The Asani auditory visual processing pipeline doesn't parallelize the way the task requires. We process sequentially, correct the spike, then listen for the next one. The human does both simultaneously. That was the first time I heard anyone on my crew directly compare our capabilities to the humans and find ours deficient. Reth Sohal was not an officer given to overstatement. She said it the way she said everything. As fact, without emotion, without editorializing. I went down to the engineering bay. Kellis Vor was standing by the secondary console, her hands at her sides, her posture rigid in the way Aseni adopt when they are controlling a strong emotion. She was an engineer with 9 years of service, 3 commendations, and a spotless performance record. She had just lost 8 hours of work because her nervous system could not do what a human's did without effort. Kellis, Commander, I'm sorry, don't be. Reth Sohal says it's a hardware problem, not a performance problem. She looked at me, she understood what I meant, and she did not like it. Reth Sohal recalculated. The second coil alone would now take 14 to 18 hours. The spikes made automated monitoring impossible and human-style split attention, monitoring, the podcast and ear technique, the only reliable approach, because the spikes were audible in the harmonic register before they appeared on screen. Reth Sohal looked at me. I understood the implication. The Aseni engineers could not match the human split attention monitoring. None of us could process auditory and visual data streams simultaneously at that speed. It was not a training deficit. It was a neurological limitation. Put Brannick on the second coil, I said. Reth Sohal did. Brannick arrived at hour 34, 4 hours before his scheduled shift. He had been sleeping. The lattice showed 6 hours of rest. Not a full cycle, but he reported himself fit. He sat down at the containment console, poured coffee from his thermal vessel, put his earpiece in, and began monitoring. He caught the first spike in under a second. He caught the next 11 without visibly reacting. His eyes stayed on the screen, his right hand made small corrections on the console, and his left hand lifted the coffee cup, set it down, lifted it again. If the spikes bothered him, he did not show it. I watched him for 2 hours. Then I went to sleep, because I had to. My 10-hour cycle was non-negotiable, and the lattice was already beginning to flag my cortisol levels. When I woke, Brannick was still at the console. 12 hours. He had been on station for 12 continuous hours since arriving 4 hours early. 16 hours total awake time since his last 6-hour rest. The lattice showed his cognitive function at 92% of baseline, a minor degradation consistent with normal fatigue, well within operational limits. I checked the repair status. The second coil was 80% complete. Brannick had caught every spike, not one miss, not one restart. At hour 48 of the overall timeline, 14 hours into Brannick's continuous shift, Retzohal flagged me privately. Commander, the human hasn't been relieved. He was supposed to be relieved at hour 40. I know, he told Kellis Vor he would stay. She objected. He said Retzohal paused, consulting her notes. He said, I'm in the groove. If you swap me out and Kellis misses a spike, we lose another 8 hours. I'll sleep when it's done. And you allowed this? I did not know whether I had the authority to override him. His biosensors show fatigue but not distress. The lattice has not flagged him for mandatory stand-down. That was true. The lattice had not flagged him, but Brannick was now approaching the 20-hour mark of continuous wakefulness since his last rest. 20 hours, which in the Asceni medical framework was the onset of hallucination. I went to the engineering bay. Brannick was sitting exactly as I had last seen him. His posture had not changed. His thermal vessel was empty. He had consumed its entire contents and had a secondary container, a disposable cup from the galley, beside it. His eyes tracked the readouts steadily. His right hand rested near the manual correction interface. He was not listening to a podcast. He was focused. Engineer Brannick. Commander, he did not look away from the screen. You have been awake for 20 hours. 22, actually. I woke up early. Your species database lists 16 to 18 hours as the onset of performance degradation. Brannick's mouth twitched. It took me a moment to realize it was a smile, not a broad one. Just a slight compression of the lips that pushed his cheeks upward by a fraction. The species database, he said, is optimistic. Meaning? Meaning 16 hours is when we start to feel it. It's not when we stop working. When do you stop working? He caught a spike, 0.3 of a second, corrected with a single motion of his right hand, and then looked at me for the first time. Depends, he said. I've done 40 before. Ship out of Ganymede, cracked reactor casing. 41 hours, actually. Slept 5. Went back for another 12. 40's not fun, but it's doable. He turned back to the screen. I stood there for a while, watching him. At one point, he caught 2 spikes in rapid succession, less than a second apart, and his hand moved so quickly that I would have missed it if I had blinked. His face did not change. I went to the medical bay. Our chief medical officer was a Dale named Senevris. Avris was precise, meticulous, and deeply suspicious of humans, which in the early months of the Accord was a common trait among Dale medical officers. He had filed 4 separate requests to exempt the Tesseract from human crew integration requirements, all denied. He considered human biology unstable, by which he meant that their baseline readings varied more than any other species he had encountered, and that he did not trust their medical self-reporting. Dr. Avris, Commander, how long can a human stay awake? Avris looked at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this question and resents having to answer it. The Coalition database lists 24 hours as the critical threshold and 28 as mandatory stand-down. I know what the database says. I'm asking what you know. Avris pulled up his personal files, the ones he kept outside the Lattice's shared system, which I had never asked to see before, and which he had never offered to show me. He turned the display toward me. These are from Earth's medical literature, he said, translated by the Accord's Cultural Exchange team and annotated by myself over the past 8 months. The relevant dataset is here, he pointed. The dataset was a summary of human sleep deprivation studies conducted over the past several 100 years of Earth history. The earliest entries were crude: military experiments, endurance contests, voluntary deprivation challenges undertaken for reasons that Avris had annotated as unclear, possibly entertainment. The later entries were clinical, controlled, peer-reviewed. The numbers were not consistent with the Coalition database. 24 hours without sleep, cognitive function degraded by 8 to 15%, mood changes, irritability, reduced patience, shortened temper, fine motor control slightly diminished, reaction time mildly slowed, all subjects fully functional. 36 hours, cognitive function degraded by 15 to 25%, impaired judgment in complex decision-making, physical coordination reduced, microsleeps possible, involuntary episodes of sleep lasting 2 to 30 seconds, often unnoticed by the subject. All subjects still capable of performing routine tasks. 48 hours. Cognitive function degraded by 25 to 40%. Significant mood instability. Impaired memory consolidation. Perceptual distortions possible, not hallucinations, but misinterpretation of visual and auditory stimuli. Physical symptoms including elevated cortisol, increased blood pressure, tremor in extremities. Subjects described as zombie-like in some annotations, but critically. Still ambulatory, still responsive, still capable of performing rehearsed tasks. 72 hours. Severe cognitive degradation. Hallucinations common. Emotional volatility. significant physical deterioration, decision-making capacity substantially impaired. But, and this was the part I read 3 times, still alive, still ambulatory, still responsive to external stimuli, capable in documented cases of performing simple tasks, following orders, and maintaining basic situational awareness. 72 hours. For an Aseni, 72 hours without sleep would produce brain death. The organ cascade would be complete. There would be nothing left to resuscitate. Avarice, I said slowly. The Coalition database lists 24 hours as the critical threshold. Yes. But their literature says subjects are fully functional at 24 hours, with an 8 to 15% degradation, which, by Aseni standards, is within normal operational variance on a difficult day. Avarice said nothing. Who provided the numbers for the Coalition database, the human delegation? And you believe they were accurate? Avarice made the Dale expression that I had learned over months of service with him to interpret as controlled fury. I believe, he said, that the human delegation provided the numbers they wanted us to have. I stared at the display for a long time. The clinical summaries, the annotated studies, the deterioration curves, the Aseni curve was a cliff. Function, 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 collapse. The human curve was a slope. A long, gradual, remarkably gentle slope that took 3 full days to reach the point where the Aseni body reached in 12 hours. What about recovery? I asked. What about it? After 72 hours of deprivation, what do they need to recover? Avarice scrolled to a different dataset. 8 to 12 hours of sleep. In some documented cases, as little as 4 hours followed by a second period of 4 hours, with a waking interval between. Full cognitive recovery within 24 to 48 hours of resuming normal sleep patterns. Full recovery. Full recovery. I did the arithmetic. An Aseni who somehow survived 30 hours without sleep, which was theoretically possible, though it had never been clinically documented, would require 60 hours of medically supervised recovery sleep, neurological assessment, and in many cases, pharmaceutical intervention to repair endocrine damage. The process was slow, painful, and sometimes incomplete. A human slept for 8 hours and was fine. I stood in Avarice's medical bay, staring at the display, while the hum of the Tesseract systems filled the silence between us. The display showed 2 curves overlaid on the same graph. The Aseni fatigue to collapse curve and the human equivalent. The Aseni curve was a cliff face. Steady performance, steady performance, steady performance, then a vertical drop. The human curve was a gentle, almost leisurely decline, a hill, not a cliff, stretching across 3 full days before reaching the bottom of the Aseni cliff. Show me the recovery curves, I said. Avarice adjusted the display. 2 new lines appeared, mirrored versions of the fatigue curves, starting from the point of collapse and tracking upward toward baseline. The Aseni recovery curve was slow. After a theoretical 30-hour deprivation event, which again would likely be fatal. Recovery required 60 hours of medically supervised sleep, hormonal therapy, neural pathway stimulation, and in documented Dale cases with similar biology, surgical intervention to repair endocrine damage. The curve rose in stuttered increments, never quite reaching the original baseline. There was always residual damage, always a scar. The human recovery curve was a near vertical line. 8 to 12 hours of sleep. Full return to baseline within 24 to 48 hours. No medical interventions, no pharmaceutical support, no therapy, sleep, food, coffee. This is real, I said. It was not a question. This is peer-reviewed research from human academic institutions spanning 300 years of study, Avarice said. I have verified the translation. I have cross-referenced the methodology. The sample sizes are large. The results are consistent. And the Coalition database. The Coalition database is a political document, Commander. It was negotiated, not researched. The human delegation sat across from the Medical Standards Board and provided numbers that would make their species look manageable, controllable, subject to the same constraints as everyone else. He paused. They are not subject to the same constraints as everyone else. Why didn't you report this earlier? Avarice looked at me with the expression I had come to know well, the one that said he had tried. I filed 4 integration exemption requests. Each one cited the inadequacy of the Coalition species database regarding human physiology. Each one was denied on the grounds that the database had been jointly negotiated and ratified by all parties, including the human delegation, and that revisiting it would constitute a breach of Accord protocols. He turned back to the display. I was told, in effect, that the humans had agreed to the numbers, and therefore the numbers were correct. They agreed to the numbers because the numbers made them look weaker than they are. Yes, I left the medical bay and went back to the engineering bay. Brannick was still there. It was now hour 52 of the overall repair timeline. and Brannick had been continuously awake for 24 hours since his last 6-hour rest. 30 hours total awake in the past 36 hours. By the Coalition database, he should have been at mandatory stand-down 4 hours ago. His biosensor readings, which I now pulled up on my personal display for the first time, showed the following. Heart rate 64 beats per minute, up from his resting 58. Blood pressure elevated, but within human normal range. Cortisol levels at 160% of baseline. Body temperature unchanged. Cognitive function, as estimated by the lattice based on reaction time, motor precision, and task completion rates, at 87% of baseline. 87%. After 30 hours awake, the lattice's algorithm was calibrated for Osany baselines, where 87% would indicate early stage fatigue, requiring monitoring, but not intervention. I pulled up the second coil's repair log. Brannick had been on station for 18 continuous hours. He had detected and corrected 43 containment spikes. The response time, 0.44 seconds. Not one miss, not one restart. The second coil repair was 94% complete. I did not order him off the console. I am not sure, even now, whether that was the correct decision. But I will tell you what I told the Coalition Council. I did not believe, based on the evidence in front of me, that replacing him with a rested Osany engineer, who had already demonstrated an inability to catch the spikes with the same speed and consistency, would improve the outcome. The mathematics were clear, the coil repair was almost done, and Brannick was, by every metric I could measure, still performing at a level that exceeded what my own officers could achieve fully rested. I stayed in the engineering bay. I sat in the observation alcove above the containment console, and I watched him work. At hour 20 of his continuous shift, hour 32 of his total wakefulness, I noticed the first behavioral change. Brannick stopped drinking coffee, not because he was full. His thermal vessel and his secondary cup were both empty. He had consumed, by my estimate, approximately 2 liters of coffee in the past 20 hours. He sat still for a long moment, staring at the readouts. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, the jacket he had draped over the back of his chair, and produced a small foil packet. He tore it open with his teeth, shook something into his palm, and put it in his mouth. "What is that?" I asked over the intercom. He chewed twice. "Caffeine tab. 200 milligrams. Is that a stimulant?" "Same thing that's in the coffee, Commander. Just faster." He swallowed, took a breath, and went back to work. I watched the lattice feed. His heart rate increased to 68 within 6 minutes. His reaction time, which had been slowly creeping upward from 0.4 seconds to 0.5, dropped back to 0.38. The caffeine did not restore him to baseline. It arrested his decline and pulled him backward up the slope by a small but measurable increment. Humans, I was learning, did not simply endure fatigue, they managed it. They had developed over centuries, possibly millennia, a pharmacological and behavioral toolkit for extending their operational window beyond what their biology intended. Coffee, caffeine tablets, controlled micronaps, strategic allocation of effort. They treated their own exhaustion the way a pilot treats a damaged engine. Not with panic, with calibration. At hour 56, 22 continuous hours on station, 34 total awake, the second coil repair completed. Brannick ran the post-repair diagnostic, confirmed the coil was stable, and logged the result with Reth Sohal. Then he turned to the third coil's dataset, which Reth Sohal had loaded onto the console during the last hour of the second repair. "Brannick," I said. He looked up. His eyes were slightly reddened. The skin beneath them was darker than it had been 20 hours ago. A discoloration that I now understood was a visible indicator of fatigue in humans, caused by increased blood flow to the periorbital area. "Commander, you need to sleep. After the third coil. The third coil will take 12 to 18 hours. I know, you have been awake for 34 hours, 35. He paused, and a half. "Your species database lists, Commander." His voice was patient, not sharp, not defiant. Patient, the way you speak to someone who is making a reasonable point that happens to be wrong. My species database was written by diplomats. I've done this before. I know what 35 hours feels like. It feels like 35 hours. My hands work. My eyes work. I can hear the spikes. If I go to sleep now and Kellis Vor takes the third coil, she's going to miss a spike in the first 6 hours and we restart. You know it. I know it. I looked at Kellis Vor, who was standing near the hatch. She did not argue. She was an excellent engineer, one of the best in my crew, and she had missed 2 spikes during a 12-hour shift that Brannick had run for, 22 hours without missing one. "How long can you keep going?" I asked. Brannick considered this. Not theatrically. He genuinely thought about it. The way you think about a technical question with an honest answer. 48 hours total is where I start getting stupid, he said. Not dangerous stupid. Just slow, stupid. I'll catch the spikes, but I won't be able to hold a conversation about anything complicated. After 60 hours, I'll start seeing things that aren't there. Shadows in my peripheral vision, that sort of thing. After 72, I'll be operating on muscle memory and caffeine and nothing else, and you should probably have someone standing behind me in case I fall asleep sitting up. He said this the way a man describes the weather forecast. Sunny in the morning, cloudy by evening, possible rain overnight. You've been to 72 hours before? I asked. Once. Emergency dry dock repair on a freighter out past the belt, 74 hours. Slept for 14 afterward. Woke up hungry. He shrugged. I was younger then. I looked at the faces of my officers in the engineering bay. Reth Sohal stood near the primary console, her arms folded, her expression carefully neutral. Kellis Vor was by the secondary station. Two other Asani engineers, Dren Kellis and Jorat stood near the hatch, listening. None of them said anything, but I could read the room. I had commanded Aseni officers for 12 years, and I knew what controlled disbelief looked like. Reth Sohal spoke first, and her voice was very level. Commander, he's describing a state of progressive neurological failure. He's telling us he will hallucinate, lose cognitive function, and potentially lose consciousness at his station, and he's asking permission to proceed. She was right. In Asani medical terms, everything Brannick had described, the cognitive dulling, the peripheral hallucinations, the risk of involuntary sleep onset, constituted a cascade of symptoms that would trigger an immediate medical evacuation and a minimum 48-hour recovery protocol. He was describing what we would classify as the late stages of a medical emergency, and he was describing it as a work plan. Brannick, I said, if you reach a point where you cannot continue, I'll say so. I'm not trying to prove anything, Commander. I'm trying to fix your drive. That was the sentence. The one I have replayed in my mind more than any other. Not defiance. Not bravery. Practical clarity. The drive needed fixing. He could fix it. The fact that fixing it would require him to push through states of consciousness that would hospitalize or kill any Assassinee on this ship was to him a logistical consideration. A cost he was willing to pay. Not gladly, not dramatically. Just willing. The way you pay a toll to cross a bridge. I made the decision. I am not proud of it, and I am not ashamed of it. It was the correct decision for the circumstances. Stay on the console, I said. Koresh relieves you in 12 hours whether the coil is done or not. Koresh is good, Brannick said. She's fast. Let me do the first 8, the hard part, and she can take the cleanup. Agreed. He turned back to the screen. The third coil's isolation sequence began. I went to the bridge. I had duties of my own, course plotting, crew management, status reports to Coalition Fleet Command via the emergency beacon relay. But part of me, the part that was no longer watching the containment console and had nothing to monitor, began doing what I should have done at the beginning of the crisis. I read the human file, not the Coalition database summary, not the sanitized medical thresholds provided by the human delegation, the actual file, the one assembled by Dale intelligence analysts over the previous decade using intercepted human media, declassified military records, academic publications, and first-person accounts from the handful of alien observers who had spent extended time among humans. The section on sleep was 31 pages long. I read it in one sitting, which was itself a minor irony. I was reading about a species that could go 3 days without rest while I counted the hours until my own mandatory sleep cycle. The file began with the basic biology, which I have already described. The human sleep cycle is 7 to 8 hours. Deprivation produces a gradual slope of degradation over 72 to 96 hours, after which the body forces unconsciousness regardless of the subject's will. Recovery is rapid, and in most cases, complete. But the biology was not the part that disturbed me. The file's second section was titled Cultural and Military Implications, and it was written in the dry, methodical tone of a adult analyst who has encountered something she can't explain and has decided to document it, thoroughly rather than attempt interpretation. Humans, the analyst wrote, do not regard sleep deprivation as a crisis. They regard it as a condition. This distinction is critical. For every species in the coalition, sleep deprivation is an emergency, a physiological failure state that triggers immediate medical response. For humans, it is a circumstance to be managed. They have words for it that carry no connotation of alarm. Pulling an all-nighter, burning the midnight oil, running on fumes, powering through. These phrases describe voluntary, deliberate, culturally normalized decisions to defer sleep in order to continue working, fighting, caring for offspring, traveling, or, in a number of documented cases, socializing. They do this routinely. The analyst's data indicated that the average human adult experiences sleep deprivation, defined as sleeping fewer than 6 hours in a 24, Our period, approximately 60 to 80 times per standard year, not in crisis conditions, under normal circumstances. They stay awake to complete work assignments, to tend to sick family members, to transport goods over long distances, to stand guard, to create art, to consume entertainment media, to worry about problems they cannot solve. They do it voluntarily. No other species in the Coalition database has a cultural concept of voluntary sleep deprivation. We do not have a word for all-nighter, because the concept is biologically impossible. The idea that a conscious being would choose to remain awake beyond its safe operational window, not because of an emergency, but because it wanted to finish something, is, from an Oseni perspective, comparable to choosing to stop breathing because you want to keep swimming. The third section of the file was titled Military Applications, and it was the section that made me set down my reading tablet and stare at the wall of my quarters for a long time. The analyst began with historical examples. Human military history, she noted, was saturated with accounts of extended operations conducted by sleep-deprived forces, not as desperate last stands, but as deliberate tactical choices. During a conflict called the Second World War, a planetary war fought among human nation-states approximately 400 years before first contact, human military units routinely operated for 72 to 96 hours during offensive operations. Their commanders planned for it. Their logistics systems were designed around it. They developed stimulant compounds, amphetamines, caffeine concentrates, later more refined pharmacological agents, specifically to extend operational windows beyond what baseline biology allowed. The soldiers did not consider this remarkable. They considered it the job. In more recent history, the century before first contact, human special operations units conducted missions lasting 120 to 140 hours with minimal sleep. The analyst documented 6 case studies in which human operators maintained combat effectiveness through periods of deprivation that would have killed every species in the coalition twice over. In each case, the operators recovered fully within 48 hours of returning to base. One case study stood out. A human naval engineering team, tasked with repairing a damaged reactor on a deep-sea vessel, a submarine, the analyst explained, which was a vessel designed to operate beneath the liquid surface of Earth's oceans, worked for 89 consecutive hours to prevent a catastrophic failure. The team leader, a woman, slept for a total of 4 hours during the 89, distributed across 3 naps of varying length, none longer than 90 minutes. When the repair was complete, she filed her incident report, ate a meal, slept for 11 hours, and returned to duty the following day. The analyst noted that this case was not classified. It was not secret. It was published in a human engineering journal as a routine case study in crisis management, with the sleep deprivation element mentioned as a logistical detail rather than the central finding. The humans who read it were not alarmed by the 89 hours. They were interested in the reactor repair technique. This, the analyst wrote, was the most important finding. Humans did not regard extended sleep deprivation as a feat. They regarded it as a circumstance. Siege warfare, the analyst continued, is the dominant strategic paradigm of galactic conflict. It is predicated on a single biological constant. The defender must sleep. A besieging force does not need to breach walls, overwhelm defenses, or win a decisive engagement. It needs only to maintain pressure long enough for the defender's sleep-deprived crew to begin making mistakes. In every recorded conflict between coalition species, this timeline is predictable. 36 to 48 hours of sustained pressure will degrade a defending crew's performance below combat-effective thresholds. 72 hours will render them incapable of coordinated defense. This is why siege warfare works. This is why it has worked for thousands of years across dozens of species. The mathematics are simple. The attacker rotates fresh crews while the defender's crew degrades. Time is the weapon. Sleep is the vulnerability. The analyst's conclusion was 2 paragraphs long. Against a human crew, she wrote, siege warfare's fundamental assumption fails. A human crew under siege can maintain combat-effective performance for a minimum of 48 hours and degraded but functional performance for 72 to 96 hours without crew rotation. They will manage their fatigue with stimulants, micronaps, and task redistribution. They will prioritize critical functions and accept degradation in non-essential areas. They will continue to fight, make decisions, operate systems, and coordinate responses long after every other species would have collapsed. A besieging force expecting the standard 36 to 48-hour degradation window would find, at hour 48, that the human crew is still alert, still fighting, and still catching the spikes. The analyst did not editorialize. She did not speculate on what this meant for galactic strategy. She simply wrote, This variable has not yet been incorporated into coalition strategic planning models. It should be. I finished reading, I checked the time. My sleep cycle was 6 hours away. Brannick's shift on the third coil was in hour 5. I went back to the engineering bay. He was still there. Hour 40 of continuous wakefulness, 6 hours into the third coil repair. His posture had changed. He was leaning forward slightly, his elbows on the console, his weight on his forearms. His eyes were narrower, not closed, but not as wide as they had been. His right hand still rested near the manual correction interface. His left hand was wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee. Someone, possibly Koresh, had brought him a refill. The lattice readout showed his cognitive function at 79% of baseline. His reaction time had increased to 0. 6 seconds, slower than his best, but still faster than Kellis Vor's rested average. His cortisol was at 210% of baseline. His blood pressure was elevated. His body temperature had dropped by 0.3 degrees, a human fatigue indicator the lattice flagged but did not classify as critical. He had caught 19 spikes in 6 hours, not one miss. I sat in the observation alcove and watched. At one point, hour 42, Brannick stopped moving. His hand went still on the console, his eyes unfocused. The lattice registered a change in his brainwave pattern, a brief dip toward the low frequency range associated with sleep onset. 3 seconds. Then his eyes snapped back into focus, his hand twitched, and he caught a spike that had begun 0.2 seconds before his lapse. He corrected it cleanly, took a breath, and drank his coffee. Microsleep, he said aloud, to no one. Mark it. Koresh, who was standing by the secondary console, made a notation on her tablet. She did not look alarmed. She looked like a colleague performing a routine quality check. How many is that? Brannick asked. Third one, in the last hour. That's fine. They'll increase. Let me know if I miss a spike during one. You haven't missed a spike in 38 hours, Colm. Yeah, well, famous last words. He drank his coffee. He went back to work. I looked at Koresh more carefully. She was standing with her weight on one hip, her arms crossed loosely, watching Brannick's readouts on the secondary display with the casual attentiveness of someone who has done this kind of partnered monitoring before. She was not hovering. She was not anxious. She was standing watch the way a spotter stands behind a weightlifter, present, ready, but not expecting to be needed. I realized that the humans had their own system, not the lattice, not the coalition's fatigue management protocols. Something older, something that lived in their behavior rather than in their technology. They watched each other. They tracked each other's microsleeps and mood shifts and caffeine intake. They had a procedure for this, not written in any manual, not encoded in any AI, but practiced and understood. Koresh knew when to push Brannick toward a nap and when to let him continue. Brannick knew when to call his own microsleeps aloud so she could log them and watch for deterioration. They managed each other's decline the way they managed a machine running hot, not by shutting it down, but by monitoring the gauges and adjusting the load. Dren Kellis, one of my Ossini engineers, came into the bay during hour 44 to check on a secondary system. He stood in the doorway and looked at Brannick, at the reddened eyes, the darkened skin beneath them, the slightly hunched posture, the hand that still moved with precision to catch spikes, and then looked at me. How long has he been awake? Dren asked quietly. 44 hours, with a 90-minute rest in the middle. Dren stood very still. He was a young officer 4 years into his service, and he had never served with humans before the Tesseract. Is he all right? Define all right. Dren did not answer. He watched Brannick catch 2 more spikes, clean, quick corrections, no hesitation, and then left the bay without another word. I found out later that he went directly to the medical bay and asked Avris whether it was medically possible for an Osseni to train themselves to stay awake for 44 hours. Avris told him no. He told him it was not possible for any species in the Coalition database. He told him it was possible only for humans. Dren, I am told, did not ask any more questions. I realized, sitting in that alcove, that I was watching something I had never seen before, and that none of my training had prepared me for. I was watching a human being operate in a physiological state that would have rendered any member of my species unconscious or dead, and he was doing it with the grim, irritable, mildly inconvenienced demeanor of a man who has been stuck in traffic too long and is annoyed but not alarmed. He was not heroic. He was not pushing through with clenched teeth and dramatic resolve. He was tired, visibly, obviously tired. His eyes were red, his movements were slower. His voice, when he spoke, had a flattened quality, less inflection, fewer words, shorter sentences. He was not operating at peak performance, and he knew it. But he was operating, steadily, competently, reliably. The spikes came and he caught them. The readings drifted and he corrected them. The repair progressed. At hour 44, 8 hours into the third coil, 44 hours since his last real sleep, Brannick looked up at Koresh. I'm going to take 90 minutes, he said. He stood up. He walked to the corner of the engineering bay where the emergency supply lockers were. He pulled out a thermal blanket, standard issue, designed for Varothi atmospheric failures, and laid it on the deck plating. He folded his jacket into a pillow. He lay down on the deck of an alien starship's engineering bay, pulled the blanket to his chin, and closed his eyes. The lattice registered sleep onset in under 4 minutes. Koresh took the containment console. She was good, sharp, fast, well rested by comparison. She had slept 6 hours in the past 12. For a human, that was adequate. Not optimal, but adequate. I watched her for the first 30 minutes. She caught 2 spikes. Her response time was zero point 0.5 seconds, faster than Kellis Vor, slower than Brannick at his best, but clean. Then I watched Brannick sleep. He slept on a metal deck, in a room filled with the hum of containment equipment, and the intermittent chime of spike alerts, under lighting that had not been dimmed because the repair required full visual clarity. He slept the way a stone sits at the bottom of a stream, completely, heavily, without visible awareness of his surroundings. His heart rate dropped to 52 within 10 minutes. His cortisol levels began declining. His body temperature stabilized. 90 minutes later, not 89, not 91, but 90, he opened his eyes. He sat up. He folded the blanket, retrieved his jacket, and walked to the galley. He came back with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Koresh. How's it looking? Clean. 2 spikes. No misses. Good. He sat back down at the console. Koresh yielded the chair. Brannick took a long drink of coffee, set the cup on the edge of the console, and resumed monitoring. The lattice showed his cognitive function at 83% of baseline, 3 points higher than before his nap. 90 minutes of sleep on a metal deck had partially reversed the degradation of 44 hours of continuous wakefulness. I do not know how to explain what this felt like to witness. I will try. Imagine that you are an officer responsible for the safety of 182 people, and your ship is crippled in deep space, and the repair requires sustained concentration over many days, and you have been carefully managing your crew's fatigue rotations to ensure that no one exceeds their biological limits, because exceeding those limits means death or permanent damage. You have been doing this for 2 days. You are tired, your own sleep cycle is compressed, and you can feel the edges of your concentration fraying. And then you look at the human who has been awake for 44 hours, who slept for 90 minutes on the floor, who is now back at the console, drinking coffee, and catching containment spikes with a reaction time faster than your best officer can achieve fully rested. And you realize that the fatigue management system you have built, the rotations, the mandatory rest periods, the lattice monitoring, the stand-down protocols, the entire edifice of rules and safeguards that your civilization has constructed around the fragility of consciousness does not apply to him. He is outside the system, not because he is extraordinary, because his species is built differently. The third coil repair took 14 hours. Brannick monitored the containment console for 11 of those 14 hours, 8 before his 90-minute nap, 3 after Koresh relieved him for the nap, and another 3 after he returned. Koresh handled the remaining 3 hours. At hour 70 of the overall repair timeline, 11 hours after his nap, 55 hours since his last full sleep period, with only 90 minutes of rest in between, Brannick ran the final diagnostic on the third coil. It was clean. All 3 coils recalibrated. The transit drive was back online. Reth Sohal confirmed the repair from the bridge. The Tesseract resumed full transit velocity. Estimated arrival at the periphery stations, 31 hours. The engineering bay was quiet. Kellis Vor and 2 other Aseni engineers, who had come in for the final diagnostic, stood near the secondary console. Koresh was by the hatch. Reth Sohal's voice crackled over the comm with the confirmation. I was in the observation alcove, where I had been for the past 4 hours watching. Brannick sat at the containment console for a long moment after the diagnostic cleared. He did not move. His hands rested on the console's surface, palms down, fingers slightly spread. His eyes were on the readout, which now showed a flat, stable, unbroken line. No spikes, no drift, no fluctuations. Then he stood up. He moved slowly, not dramatically, not a stagger, not a sway, just slowly, the way a man moves when his body has been in one position for too long and his joints have registered a formal complaint. He straightened his back. His spine produced the same popping sequence I had heard days ago, but longer this time, more deliberate. He picked up his thermal vessel. It was empty. He looked at it, looked at the disposable cup beside it, which was also empty, and then looked at Koresh. "Galleys open?" he asked. "Should be." He walked out of the engineering bay. He did not address me. He did not address Kellis Vor or the other engineers. He walked to the secondary galley, which was 40 meters down the corridor, and I followed him because I did not know what else to do. The galley was empty. Ship's night cycle. Most of the crew was asleep or on minimal watch. Brannick walked to the beverage station, which dispensed liquids for all 4 species aboard, and pressed the controls for human standard coffee. The machine hummed. A dark liquid filled his cup. He raised it, he drank, he closed his eyes while he swallowed, and for a moment, just a moment, his face showed something that was not tiredness and not relief, but something between the two. A man taking the first drink after a long thirst, not because the thirst is gone, but because the drink is there, and he is alive to taste it. Then he opened his eyes and saw me standing in the doorway. "Commander," he said. His voice was rough. Not hoarse, rough. The way a machine sounds when it has been running at capacity for too long, and the bearings are starting to show wear. "Engineer Brannick. Drives clean. You can file the report." "I know." He drank his coffee. I stood there. The silence was not uncomfortable. Exactly. But it had weight. "Brannick, Commander, how do you feel?" He considered this. Not quickly. Slowly. The way he had considered my question about how long he could keep going with the same honest, unhurried assessment. "Tired," he said. "Head's thick. Eyes feel like someone rubbed sand in them. My back hurts, but my back always hurts, so that doesn't count." He took another drink. "I need 8 hours, maybe 10. I'll be fine. You've been awake for 55 hours, 57. But 90 minutes of that was the nap. So call it 55 and a half of actual uptime." He shrugged. "It's not my record." "What is your record?" 74, like I said. "And you were functional at 74? Define functional. Capable of performing your duties." Brannick made a sound, a short exhalation through his nose. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. "At 74, I was capable of performing my duties the way a bad copy of a painting is capable of being a painting. Everything's there, but the edges are blurry and the colors are off. I wouldn't want to do surgery at 74, but I could monitor a containment console." He finished his coffee. He rinsed the cup, dried it, and placed it in the rack with a precision that seemed instinctive, the habit of a man who cleans up after himself, even when he is so tired he can barely see. "Good night, Commander." "Good night, Brannick." He walked to Deck 7. The lattice registered him in his quarters at 0247. Sleep onset at 0253. Heart rate 54, the lowest I had seen from him. He slept for 9 hours and 12 minutes. When he woke, the lattice showed his cognitive function at 97% of baseline. His cortisol had returned to normal. His blood pressure had normalized. His body temperature was back to his personal standard. The slight tremor the lattice had detected in his right hand during the last 3 hours of the repair was gone. He went to the galley. He made coffee. He ate a meal eggs, toast, something called rashers that smelled like carbon and salt. He reported to his station at his normal time. He was fine. 9 hours of sleep had erased 55 hours of wakefulness. Not reduced. Not partially recovered. Erased. The lattice could not distinguish his post-recovery readings from his day 1 baseline. He was the same man. Every measurement said so. Reth Sohal pulled me aside that morning. She had been reviewing the engineering bay logs, the full record of the repair, including Brannick's time-stamped performance data, and she had something to show me. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a chart on her tablet. "This is Brannick's spike response time across the entire repair. Each dot is one spike. The x-axis is hours of cumulative wakefulness." I looked. For the first 20 hours, his response time was consistent, 0.38 to 0.42 seconds, with minimal variance. Between hours 20 and 35, it increased gradually to 0.45 to 0.55. After his 90-minute nap, it dropped back to 0.42. During the final 3 hours, hours 50 through 55, of total wakefulness, it climbed to 0.55 to 0.65. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "You're looking at an engineer who, at his absolute worst, 55 hours without real sleep, running on caffeine and a 90-minute nap, had a reaction time of 0.65 seconds. She paused. "Kellisvor's best time, fully rested, with zero fatigue at peak cognitive function, is 0.72. I stared at the chart. "His floor is faster than our ceiling," I said. "Not for all tasks. Not for complex analysis or creative problem solving, those degrade much earlier. But for practiced motor tasks, pattern recognition, trained responses, the things you need to monitor a containment console, yes, his floor is faster than our ceiling." Reth Sohal closed the chart. She was quiet for a moment. "Commander, when the 7th Accord was signed, the General Staff's assessment was that human technical personnel would be a marginal addition to coalition crews, competent but unremarkable, an accommodation to a new partner species. I wrote that assessment. I know. I was wrong. I did not sleep well that night, or the night after, not because of the drive failure that was resolved, because of the file, because of the arithmetic, because I could not stop running the numbers. If a human crew of 30 held a deep space station and a coalition siege force maintained continuous pressure, the standard doctrine would predict crew degradation at 36 hours and functional collapse at 72. But the human crew would not collapse at 72. They would be degraded, slow, irritable, making mistakes, but alive, awake, and still fighting. And they would be managing their degradation, rotating rest in 90-minute cycles, using caffeine, prioritizing critical functions. A third of them asleep at any given time while the other two-thirds held the line, cycling through continuously, the sleeping third recovering enough in 90 minutes to go back for another 12 hours. You could not outlast them. Not with a standard siege, not with standard rotations, because their rotation could not be outpaced. They were not rotating to avoid collapse. They were rotating to optimize performance within a collapse window that was 3 to 4 times wider than any other species possessed. To siege a human crew effectively, you would need to maintain pressure for, I calculated this, and I checked the number twice, approximately 8 to 12 days. 12 days of continuous, unrelenting assault, with no gaps, no pauses, no lulls long enough for the human crew to grab 90 minutes. No fleet in the coalition had the logistics to sustain 12 days of continuous siege pressure. The attackers would run out of supplies, fuel, and crew rotations long before the human defenders ran out of consciousness. I ran the numbers again with different assumptions. What if the human crew was small, 30 personnel, as opposed to the standard garrison of 200? The math got worse, not better. A smaller human crew could manage tighter rotation cycles with less overhead. Each human needed only 90 minutes of sleep per 18-hour cycle to maintain basic functionality. 30 humans, rotating in thirds, could keep 20 on duty at all times while 10 recovered, and those 10 would be back in 90 minutes, refreshed enough to do another 12 to 18 hours. What if the attacking force used sleep deprivation weapons, sonic emitters, light bombardment, chemical agents designed to prevent sleep? The analyst's file addressed this. Human military doctrine included countermeasures for every known sleep disruption technique because humans had been using those techniques against each other for millennia. Earplugs, blackout masks, chemical sleep aids, soundproofed rest compartments. They had solved the problem of sleeping under attack because they had been attacking each other's sleep for their entire recorded history. The analyst had included one final data point, which she presented without commentary, during a human military exercise called a Hell Week, a selection process for elite combat units. Human candidates were deliberately kept awake for 5 to 5.5 days under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress. Approximately 25% of candidates completed the exercise. Those who completed it were then assigned to operational units and expected to perform at the highest level. The exercise was not classified. It was not secret. Human military recruiting materials described it publicly as an inducement to enlist. They advertised it. I wrote this in my report. I wrote all of it: the drive failure, Brannick's performance, Avris's data, the Dale intelligence file, the implications for siege doctrine. I wrote it in the flat, methodical language of an incident report because I am an Ossini officer, and that is how we communicate critical information. The report was 93 pages. The Coalition Council read it in closed session. I was asked to testify. The chamber was the standard configuration for a joint species hearing, tiered seating arranged in a half circle, with the witness position at the center, a holographic display behind me, and a translation matrix embedded in the walls to convert my Osseni speech into the 14 other languages represented in the room. 31 counselors, drawn from 11 species. I recognized Senior Counselor Drek Amisi at the top tier. He was old, very old for an Osseni, near the end of his 3rd century, and his face had the compressed, stripped-down quality of a man who has spent most of his life making decisions that affected millions and has long since stopped pretending the process is anything but arithmetic. I told them about the 70 hours. I presented the biosensor data on the holographic display, Brannick's heart rate, cortisol levels, cognitive function scores, reaction times, all plotted against the standard Osseni degradation curve. The two lines were not comparable. The Osseni curve ended at hour 30. Brannick's was still in the middle of its gentle slope. I told them about the spikes. I played back the containment console's audio log, the faint harmonic shift that preceded each spike, and the sound of Brannick's correction input, a soft mechanical click, repeated 81 times over 38 cumulative hours. I told them about the 90-minute nap on the deck of the engineering bay, and the coffee and the caffeine tablet, and the way Brannick described his own deterioration with the calm detachment of a man reading a weather report. A Dale counselor, I did not catch her name, interrupted me midway through the testimony. Watch Commander, you are describing an engineer performing his duties under difficult conditions. Why is this before the council? I pulled up the comparative chart, the one Avarice had shown me, and displayed it on the chamber's holographic screen. The two curves, the cliff and the slope. Because, counselor, I said, every strategic model in the Coalition's defensive doctrine is calibrated to the cliff, and the humans live on the slope. The chamber was quiet for 8 seconds, I counted. When I finished, Senior Counselor Drecamisi, the most senior military strategist in the Coalition, asked me the question that I have been asked many times since, and that I still do not know how to answer to anyone's satisfaction. Watch Commander Veska. In your professional assessment, is this man exceptional among humans? I thought about it. I thought about Brannick, his ordinary face, his battered thermal vessel, his thinning hair, his podcast about bridge construction, his shrug when he told me about the 74-hour repair on the Ganymede freighter, his mild, tolerant expression when I quoted the species database at him, his genuine consideration of my questions, not dismissive, not boastful, just honest. I thought about Koresh, who had been awake for 36 hours when she took the console from Brannick during his nap, and who had caught every spike, and who had shown no more concern about her own fatigue than Brannick had shown about his. I thought about the signals analyst and the field medic, the other two humans aboard the Tesseract, who had not been involved in the drive repair, and who had, during the 3-day crisis, simply continued to perform their normal duties on their normal schedules. Schedules that already involved, I now noticed, routine periods of 12 to 14 hours of continuous wakefulness, followed by 6 to 7 hours of sleep. Not crisis schedules, their normal operating rhythm. No, counselor, I said. He is not exceptional. He is, by all available evidence, average. The room was quiet for a very long time. The counselor asked me one more question. The numbers the human delegation provided for the Coalition species database, the 16 to 18-hour degradation onset, the 24-hour critical threshold, the 28-hour mandatory stand-down. You believe these were deliberately understated? I considered my answer carefully. I believe, I said, that the human delegation provided numbers that were clinically defensible and operationally conservative. The numbers describe real thresholds, real degradation, real risk. They are not lies. But they describe the point at which a human begins to decline, not the point at which a human stops functioning. For us, those are the same point. For them, they are separated by 50 hours. The counselor made a note he did not look up. 50 hours, he repeated, at minimum. Under field conditions with stimulant support and micro-rest cycles, it may be longer. The room was quiet again. I returned to the Tesseract after my testimony. The drive repair had been filed. The ship was back on its normal patrol rotation. Brannick was at his station, performing routine maintenance on the atmospheric recycling system. He nodded when I passed. Commander, Brannick. I walked past, then I stopped. Brannick, Commander. The Coalition database lists your mandatory stand-down at 28 hours. He looked up. That same slight compression of the lips, that same almost smile. Yes, Commander, is that number going to be revised? I wouldn't know, Commander. That's above my pay grade. He turned back to his work. I went to the bridge. I sat into chair. I looked at the duty roster, the one I had built so carefully around the biological needs of 4 species, the rotation schedules, the mandatory rest periods, the lattice monitoring, the stance-down protocols, the entire system. The entire architecture of crew management that assumed, as its foundational axiom, that consciousness was finite and fragile, and that every living being eventually had to close their eyes and let the dark take them. Every living being except the ones drinking coffee on Deck 7. I filed my monthly report that evening. Under the section titled Human Crew Integration Assessment, I wrote a single sentence that replaced the unremarkable I had used in the first 3 reports. I wrote, reassessment of baseline human operational capabilities is urgently recommended. Current coalition parameters may be insufficient. The Lattice forwarded the report through the standard channels. I went to sleep because I had to, because my body demanded it, because after 10 hours, the darkness would come for me whether I invited it or not, and I would be gone until my biology allowed me to return. 40 meters below my quarters, Brannick was sitting in the secondary galley, reading something on his tablet, drinking coffee. The Lattice showed him awake. It was the 14th hour of his cycle. He would go to sleep when he decided to. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. Not the 70 hours, not the spikes, not the 90-minute nap or the caffeine tablets or the 9-hour recovery. Those are data points. Impressive, alarming, worthy of tactical analysis and doctrinal revision. But the thing that keeps me awake, which is its own small irony, is the volition. Every species in this coalition sleeps because biology demands it. We are dragged under. It is not a choice. It is a process that happens to us, like gravity, like hunger, like the slow accumulation of toxins in the blood that force the body into repair mode. We do not decide to sleep. We are taken. Humans decide. They look at the darkness and they say, not yet, and the darkness waits. An hour, 5 hours, 20 hours, 50 hours. It waits because it has no choice. Because the human body, for reasons that Avarice and every xenobiologist in the coalition cannot fully explain, has a nervous system that can override its own shutdown sequence. Not indefinitely, not without cost, but long enough to finish the repair. Long enough to hold the line. Long enough to catch one more spike. I asked Avarice, after my testimony, whether there was an evolutionary explanation. He said there were several theories. Predator-rich environments requiring extended vigilance, cooperative hunting that rewarded individuals who could stay awake longer, child-rearing demands in a species with slow-maturing young. All plausible, none proven. But the result, he said, is a species that treats its own consciousness as a resource to be allocated rather than a state to be maintained. They do not have a sleep cycle in the way we understand it. They have a sleep budget. A budget. Something you spend, defer, borrow against, and repay later. I thought about siege warfare. I thought about the fleet doctrines I had studied at the Ossini Naval Academy. The elegant mathematics of attrition. The carefully modeled curves of defender fatigue. The 36 to 48-hour windows. I thought about how clean and reliable those models were. How well they worked against the Dale, the Varothi, the Kesseth, the Orinth, the Melisar. How every war in living memory had been shaped by the simple, universal, unquestioned truth that the defender must eventually sleep. I thought about Brannick, 55 hours in, making coffee in the galley at 0247 with steady hands. The 7th Coalition Accord requires the inclusion of human personnel in all deep space patrol rotations. At the time of the Tesserath's commissioning, this was regarded as a diplomatic concession, a minor inconvenience, a political gesture to a new coalition partner, 4 extra bunks on Deck 7, and a dedicated beverage station in the secondary galley. It is no longer regarded as a diplomatic concession. The coalition has, in the 14 months since my testimony, revised its tactical doctrine 6 times. The Siege Warfare Manual has been rewritten from the ground up. The human delegation has been asked, formally, by the Coalition Military Standards Board to provide updated physiological data. They have not yet responded, which Avarice interprets as confirmation that the original numbers were, in his words, the polite version. I do not know what the updated numbers will say. I do not know whether the humans will provide them honestly, or whether they will provide another set of clinically defensible thresholds that describe the beginning of decline rather than the end of function. I suspect the latter. Not out of deception, the humans I have served with are not, in my experience, dishonest, but out of the same quiet, instinctive self-preservation that governs any species' disclosure of its capabilities to a coalition it does not yet fully trust. They will tell us what they want us to know. They always have. What I know, what I have seen, is this. A man named Colm Brannick, maintenance systems engineer, unremarkable by every standard I was trained to apply, sat at a containment monitoring console for 38 cumulative hours over a 3-day crisis. He caught 81 containment spikes with an average response time of 0.44 seconds. He consumed approximately 4 liters of coffee, 2 caffeine tablets, 1 meal, and 90 minutes of sleep. He saved the Tesserath's transit drive, and by extension, the lives of 182 crew members, not through heroism or genius or any quality that any species in the coalition would recognize as extraordinary, but through the simple, biologically inexplicable ability to remain conscious when everything in the universe said he should have been asleep, and when it was over, he made coffee. I asked him once, weeks later during a routine patrol cycle, in the secondary galley over a shared pot that I had begun, reluctantly, to drink, whether the 70 hours had been difficult. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I asked questions about his biology, with that mild, tolerant, almost amused expression that I had slowly come to understand was not condescension but genuine puzzlement at my concern. It wasn't great, he said, but you kept going. Yeah, why? He thought about it. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down. Because it wasn't done yet, he said. That was all. Because it wasn't done yet. As if the alternative, stopping, sleeping, letting someone else take over, accepting that his body had limits and that exceeding them was dangerous, had occurred to him and been dismissed. Not with determination. Not with will. With the reflexive pragmatism of a man who has been taught by his species and his culture and his history that the work comes first and the rest comes after, and that the gap between I'm tired and I can't is a gap you fill with coffee. I have one more thing to report, and then I am done. 6 weeks after the drive failure, the Tesseract received a crew rotation. Two of the four humans, the signals analyst and the field medic, were replaced. Their replacements arrived on the supply shuttle, carrying their kit bags and their personal thermal vessels and their tablets loaded with podcasts and music and whatever else humans consume during the long, quiet hours when everyone else is sleeping. They reported to their stations. They performed their duties. They were unremarkable. On the first night of their deployment, I was on the bridge during the ship's night cycle. The secondary galley's internal sensors showed two heat signatures, one of the new humans, a signals analyst named Dara Price and Brannick. They were sitting across from each other, drinking coffee, talking quietly. The conversation was not logged, but the lattice registered their wakefulness. It was 0330, 7 hours past the recommended start of their sleep cycle. They were not on duty. They were not performing repairs. They were not responding to an emergency. They were simply sitting in a galley on an alien ship in deep space, awake because they wanted to be talking to each other over coffee, because it was what they did. I watched the biosensor feeds for a while. Their heart rates were low and steady. Their cortisol was baseline. They were not fatigued. They were not wired on stimulants. They were just awake in the middle of what any Oseni would recognize as the deepest, most biologically non-negotiable hour of the sleep cycle, awake, by choice. I turned off the display and went to my quarters. I had 4 hours left before my cycle ended, and the darkness took me. I lay in my bunk, in the dim of the ship's night, listening to the hum of the drive that Brannick had saved, and I thought about what the Coalition Council would do with my report, and what the revised siege doctrine would look like, and whether any of it would matter in the end. Because you can revise a doctrine, you can rewrite a manual, you can update a database and recalculate a model and issue a new set of tactical guidelines, but you cannot revise biology. You cannot rewrite the fact that every species in this coalition, everyone, sleeps because it must, while the humans sleep because they choose to. And you cannot calculate the full implications of a species that looks at its own biological limits, the way Brannick looked at the containment console during hour 55, not with fear, not with defiance, but with the calm, steady, mildly irritated patience of a man who knows the limit is there, knows he is approaching it, and has decided it can wait. I have heard officers from 11 species discuss this testimony in the months since. I have heard it called alarming, destabilizing, and tactically significant. I have heard one Varothi admiral call it the single most important intelligence briefing of the post-Akkad era. I have heard a Kesseth strategist suggest that the entire coalition defense posture needs to be rebuilt from first principles. None of them have said the thing that I think when I am lying in my bunk at night, watching my 10-hour cycle close around me like a tide. The thing I think is this: we built our civilizations around the need to rest. Our cities dim their lights on schedule. Our ships enforce sleep compliance. Our wars are won by the species that can manage its exhaustion most efficiently within the narrow window that biology allows. The humans did not build their civilization around the need to rest. They built it around the refusal. They built hospitals staffed by doctors who work 36-hour shifts. They built armies that march through the night. They built an entire culture that rewards the person who sleeps last and wakes first, that treats exhaustion as a badge of competence, that has 100 phrases for staying awake and only one, sleeping in, for staying asleep, and even that one carries a faint note of guilt. They are not like us. They are not a variation of us. They are something else, something that looked at the same biological constraint that governs every conscious species in this galaxy and said, I acknowledge the limit. I will reach it eventually. But not yet. The coffee is still warm. The work is not done. The limit can wait.